The Anunnaki appear in the very first stories humanity ever pressed into clay. In the oldest Sumerian texts, dating to around 3200 BCE, they emerge not as minor spirits but as fundamental forces, cosmic architects who governed the fragile line between heaven and earth. To the people of Mesopotamia, they were not simply gods to be prayed to, but the very structure of existence itself, woven into the pattern of sky and soil. Their name reveals this role. Anu, the Sky Father, ruler of the unreachable heavens, and Ki, the earth itself, together forming Anunnaki, the offspring of Anu, deities whose dominion spanned from the vault of the stars down to the fertile plains where rivers carved their way through clay. It was more than a title. It was a cosmic genealogy. These beings stood as bridges between unreachable height and human life, the intermediaries who made order possible. Cuneiform inscriptions from the earliest cities offer glimpses of their presence. In the city of Uruk, temple inventories list offerings to the Anunna who judge and the Anunna of heaven and earth. By 3000 BCE, the idea of a divine council, a collective assembly of gods, had already taken firm root. Power in this world did not arise from kings alone. It descended from the heavens and was confirmed by the deliberations of the Anunnaki. The Sumerian king list makes this belief explicit. Compiled during the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, but drawing on much older traditions, it begins with a solemn declaration: kingship descended from heaven. Its earliest rulers are given lifespans that stretch beyond imagination. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Enmen, Lu, Anna of Bad Tibera for 43,200 years. These were not figures of flesh and blood, but symbols of cosmic time. By extending human reigns into the tens of thousands of years, the scribes were telling their listeners that the first kings ruled under the direct supervision of the Anunnaki, and thus they lived inside eternity. Archaeology gives this belief a tangible frame. At Eridu, often remembered as the world's first city, excavations reveal 17 successive temples, each built upon the ruins of the last, stretching back to around 5000 BCE. These sanctuaries were not random piles of brick. Even the earliest levels show planning, raised platforms, alignment to the cardinal directions, and deliberate layering. Imagine generations of builders returning to the same sacred spot, tearing down what age had crumbled and lifting new walls in its place, always higher, always closer to the sky. The myths of Eridu make clear why. In the Eridu Genesis, the Anunnaki are described as active participants in the founding of civilization. Once humankind was created, they gathered to assign kingship and to determine destinies. They did not rule as solitary figures, but as a council, a collective of cosmic legislators, whose debates and decrees mirrored the assemblies that humans themselves would later form. And so, from the very beginning, life in Mesopotamia was bound to the idea that heaven and earth were in dialogue. The Anunnaki stood at the center of that dialogue, not remote but intertwined with the rhythms of time, the rise of kings, and the foundations of cities. To the people who first looked up at the endless stars, their world was not silent. It was governed, ordered, and shaped by these ancient powers, the keepers of balance between sky and soil, gods who were also the architects of reality. If the Anunnaki gave order to the cosmos, they also gave structure to earthly rule. The Sumerian king list, one of the most influential texts of Mesopotamia, begins with a bold statement: kingship descended from heaven. In those few words, the foundations of political life were set. Authority was not something humans claimed for themselves. It was a gift passed downward, wrapped in divine mandate. The king list records rulers from an age long before the flood, the antediluvian kings whose reigns stretched across staggering lengths of time. Alulim of Eridu was said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Onmen Luana of Bad Tibera for 43,200 years. These numbers are far beyond the span of mortal life, but they were never meant as history in the way we think of it. They were symbols, pointing to a world where kingship operated on cosmic time, guided directly by the Anunnaki. To reign in those days was to dwell in eternity, where human years were measured against the rhythm of the stars. Archaeology grounds these myths in the soil of southern Mesopotamia. At Eridu, regarded as the first city, archaeologists uncovered 17 layers of temples stacked one atop another. Beginning around 5000 BCE, each generation rebuilt upon the last, raising platforms higher, aligning sanctuaries to the cardinal directions, orienting human structures toward the heavens. These layers are not simply ruins, they are a physical echo of devotion, showing how people returned again and again to the same sacred place. We can imagine the scene, the smell of bitumen rising from fresh bricks, the low chants of workers setting mud blocks in place, the shimmer of white plaster in the sunday. A pilgrim approaches the towering structure at dawn, offerings of barley and fish in hand. To climb the steps is to move closer to the gods, each platform a stage between earth and sky. The myths of Eridu reinforce this vision. The Eridu Genesis describes how the Anunnaki, after creating humankind, established the first cities and appointed kings to govern. These rulers were not independent lords but caretakers chosen by divine decree. Their authority was fragile unless anchored in ritual, sacrifice, and obedience to the will of the Anunnaki. At Nippur, a city sacred to Enlil, this principle was carved into stone and ritual. Kings from across Mesopotamia travelled there to receive formal recognition. Without Enlil's blessing, a ruler's claim was uncertain. Inscriptions describe how even great kings restored temples for the Anunnaki, who decree fate, acknowledging that power flowed from the assembly of gods, not from earthly ambition alone. This intertwining of kingship and divinity shaped the Mesopotamian city itself. At the centre stood the temple, the home of the patron god. Around it stretched houses, markets, workshops, and fields all arranged in reflection of cosmic order. A king ruled from his palace, but his legitimacy depended on the rituals performed in the temple beside him. For the people of these early cities, life was lived inside a sacred design. To walk its streets was to move through a space modelled on the cosmos. Each offering, each procession, each law proclaimed from the palace steps echoed the belief that heaven had once bent down and placed a crown upon the earth. And at the heart of this system stood the Anunnaki, not distant, but present in every temple stone, every grain tithed, every festival that renewed the bond between sky and soil. In the Mesopotamian imagination, the Anunnaki were not solitary gods ruling by whim. They governed together, through councils, assemblies where the destinies of both gods and mortals were debated and decreed. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest surviving creation stories, describes such a gathering. After humankind was fashioned, the Anunnaki met in council to decide its fate. Kings were appointed, roles assigned, and the rhythms of civilization set in motion. The gods did not speak as individuals, but as a collective authority, shaping the order of the world through deliberation. At Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil, this theology left its imprint on both inscriptions and ritual. Kings who restored temples there wrote of doing so for the Anunnaki who decree fate. Even Enlil, the mighty storm god, acted within this larger framework. His power, though immense, was bound to the decisions of the assembly. In this vision, no deity ruled alone. Authority flowed through dialogue, through balance, through the weight of many voices. The chamber of these divine meetings was called the Ubshu Ukina, often imagined as a cosmic courtroom. Texts describe 50 great Anunnaki taking their places, joined by 7 others known as the gods who decree fate. The number 50 carried the sense of completeness, while 7 mirrored the planets that wander through the heavens, and the 7 days that mark a human week. Numbers themselves became symbols of divine order. One can picture the scene as the scribes described it. A vast hall, gods seated in a circle, the air heavy with silence before the first voice rose. Arguments given, counter-arguments offered, witnesses presented, verdicts declared. The structure resembled earthly councils, for human assemblies were thought to mirror these celestial gatherings. Just as kings heard advice from priests and elders, so too did the gods deliberate among themselves before pronouncing judgment. The Enlil and Ninlil composition offers a window into these proceedings. It describes the gods gathered to consider questions of life, death, and destiny, their decisions binding not only mortals but one another. Through such texts, Mesopotamians came to believe that the universe was not ruled by chance, but by order established through careful procedure, debate, and consensus. This belief extended into daily life. When city elders met in courtyards to settle disputes, or when scribes recorded testimony on clay tablets, people saw in these actions a reflection of the divine model. Justice was not arbitrary. It followed patterns as old as the heavens themselves. To live in Mesopotamia was to sense that fate itself was being debated above, in chambers unseen, where the Anunnaki weighed the balance of life and death. Their councils were mirrors of law, anchors of order, and the assurance that the world, however unpredictable, rested on a structure both cosmic and eternal. The pantheon of Mesopotamia was not a flat landscape of equals. It was layered, carefully divided, with each class of gods serving its own role in the cosmic order. At the top stood the Anunnaki, the great assembly, arbiters of fate and guardians of balance. Yet alongside them, other divine groups carried their own responsibilities. Texts distinguish clearly between the Anunnaki and the Igigi. The word Igigi, drawn from a root meaning to see or to watch, marks them as celestial observers. They were associated with the wandering stars and the phenomena of the heavens. While the Anunnaki judged and decreed, the Igigi were ever watchful, their gaze fixed on the vault of the sky. Priests described them in connection with astronomy and divination, the art of reading signs written in the stars. We can imagine a priest ascending the steep steps of a ziggurat under a night sky. At the summit, he sets down his writing board, tilts his face upward, and waits. As Venus glides across the horizon, or Mars flares red in the east, he records the movements carefully in cuneiform. These were not mere notes of light in the heavens, they were messages, traces of the Igigi, interpreters of what the Anunnaki had decreed. Alongside these groups were the seven who decree fate. Though closely tied to the Anunnaki, they formed a sharper circle within the wider council, a body with executive power. Their decisions shaped destinies at a more personal scale, determining the outcomes of cities and individuals alike. The number 7 carried profound resonance. 7 planets visible to the eye, 7 days forming the rhythm of the week, 7 gates leading into the underworld. Each cycle of 7 was seen as echoing cosmic truth. In ritual, these distinctions mattered. Prayers addressed the Anunnaki when one sought order and justice, but the Igigi when one needed signs from the heavens. When destinies were sought for a newborn child, for the outcome of a harvest, for the fate of a city before war, it was the 7 who were invoked, the council that sealed fate itself. Through these layers, Mesopotamians saw a universe governed not by chaos but by structure. The sky was never empty. It was filled with watchers. The earth was never left untended, it was overseen by judges. Destiny was never random. It was measured and fixed by the 7. For those who lived under this faith, daily life was lived under many gazes. To look upward at the night sky was to know one was also being observed. To listen for the outcome of omens was to accept that decisions had already been made in chambers unseen. And through it all, the Anunnaki remained supreme, their authority woven through the watchers above and the decrees of fate below, binding heaven and earth into a single ordered whole. As Mesopotamian civilization grew, so too did its language for the divine. The names of the Anunnaki shifted with time, their spellings and forms reflecting the changing dialects of Sumerian and Akkadian scribes. Early texts display a variety of constructions, hints of local traditions in each city-state. But as kingdoms unified and sought common identity, the names of the gods also became standardized. Language, like law, followed power. Each cuneiform sign pressed into clay was more than a letter. It was a ritual act, a way of making divine order visible. To write the name of the Anunnaki was to shape a fragment of the cosmos into clay, a symbolic reflection of the way temples shaped the landscape. The careful standardization of divine names mirrored the drive for theological and political unity across Sumer. This same impulse expressed itself in architecture. Rising above the plains were the ziggurats, the great step towers that embodied the link between heaven and earth. Built of sun-baked brick and faced with fired brick for durability, these colossal structures were not mere temples but cosmic mountains. Each ascending stage represented a level of the universe, a stairway between worlds. The ziggurat of Uruk, dedicated to Anu, stood as one of the earliest and most imposing. Its very alignment was deliberate, oriented to the paths of the stars and the four corners of the earth. To climb its steps was to enact a journey from the human realm upward toward the divine. Priests ascending the terraces symbolically traversed the layers of the cosmos, each stage more sacred than the last, until they reached the chamber at the summit, where the god's presence was believed to dwell. Imagine the scene on a clear night, torches flickering on the upper platforms, their light visible for miles across the dark plain. Below, the city lay in stillness, canals gleaming under moonlight, while high above, the sacred chamber glowed like a star fallen to earth. For the people of Uruk, the ziggurat was not just stone and brick. It was the axis of the universe, the place where prayers ascended and blessings descended. The symbolism of these towers endured through generations. To build was to affirm order. To rebuild was to renew cosmic balance. Each layer of brick carried inscriptions, often stamped with the king's name, and reminders that earthly rulers participated in this cosmic architecture. The ziggurat was at once a temple, a monument of power, and a theological diagram. Thus, both in words and in stone, the Anunnaki were made present. Their names written in clay, their temples rising into the sky, each reflected the same belief, that heaven and earth were bound together by human devotion and divine decree. To walk the streets of Mesopotamia was to live in a city shaped like the cosmos, where language and architecture alike spoke of gods who held the balance of all things. The presence of the Anunnaki was not confined to silent temples or distant myths. Their influence pulsed through the yearly rhythm of life, in festivals that filled the streets with music and processions, and in the temple economies that managed herds, fields, and trade across Mesopotamia. Foremost among these rituals was the Akitu festival, the New Year's celebration that renewed kingship itself. From the earliest Sumerian periods through the final centuries of Mesopotamian civilization, it marked a moment of cosmic renewal. During Akitu, the reigning monarch was ritually stripped of his power, humbled before the gods, and then restored to rule with divine blessing. The ceremony reenacted creation, chaos dissolved, order re-established, the fragile balance reaffirmed by the Anunnaki. Imagine the city alive with this festival. Drums beat in steady rhythm as priests carried statues of the gods out of their sanctuaries to walk among the people. The smell of burning incense mixed with the scent of roasted meat offered in sacrifice. Crowds pressed close to see, children lifted onto shoulders for a glimpse of shining figures draped in embroidered robes. For those gathered, the gods were no longer invisible. They were present, borne through the streets, their power passing close enough to touch. Behind the pageantry stood an immense engine of administration. Temples were not only sacred houses, but also economic giants. The archives of Drehem, dating to the Ur-3 period, reveal the staggering scale of their operations. Thousands upon thousands of animals were sacrificed each year. Sheep, goats, cattle, each meticulously recorded by scribes pressing figures into clay. These sacrifices were not waste, but part of a cycle, feeding priests and temple workers, sustaining festivals, and symbolically nourishing the divine presence itself. Temples controlled vast estates of farmland, fisheries, and orchards. They managed workshops where potters, jewelers, and textile workers labored under divine patronage. Trade caravans brought goods from distant lands, wood from the mountains, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. At temple gates, donkeys laden with grain and wool were counted and entered into ledgers, each offering a reminder that earthly wealth was tied to divine favor. Picture a scribe at work. Seated on a reed mat, stylus in hand, he presses wedge-shaped signs into damp clay as animals are led past, each one tallied with precision. To the Mesopotamians, this was more than accounting. It was ritual, a way of ensuring that what the gods decreed in heaven was properly honored on earth. In this way, ritual and economy were inseparable. Festivals like Akitu renewed the cosmic order through drama and procession. The temple's wealth sustained those festivals, fed the population, and ensured the gods received their due. To worship the Anunnaki was not only to pray or to sacrifice, but also to plant fields, tend herds, and record each offering in clay. Life itself was the offering. and as long as the cycle continued, fields yielding grain, herds replenishing, festivals renewing kingship. The people believed that the Anunnaki's favor would rest upon their cities. The Anunnaki did not remain hidden in the clouds of myth. They were carved into stone, rolled into clay, and etched into the very contracts that governed daily life. Their presence could be seen as much as it was believed. Cylinder seals, small carved stones that left impressions when rolled across clay, reveal how the gods were imagined. Again and again, the Anunnaki appear seated upon thrones, their horned crowns rising high, each pair of horns marking rank in the celestial order. Their garments are rich with folds, their posture still, their gestures dignified. In miniature, these seals carried immense weight. Whenever a merchant sealed a tablet of trade, or a scribe recorded a contract, the gods themselves were silently called as witnesses. The symbolism was unmistakable. Horned crowns proclaimed divinity, while the careful arrangement of gods on thrones echoed the structure of their councils. Even the smallest transaction became an echo of cosmic order, pressed into the clay of daily life. Law itself was bound to the Anunnaki. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest surviving legal texts, begins with a statement that the king's authority came from An and Enlil. Justice was not the invention of rulers, it descended from heaven. Each provision, each penalty, was framed as an extension of the god's mandate. To uphold the law was to walk within divine order. At the center of this authority stood the triad of great gods, Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Together they formed a balance of powers. Anu, the Sky Father, dwelling in the highest heavens. Enlil, Lord of air and storm, deeply involved in human affairs. And Enki, Lord of wisdom and water, the patron of craft, invention, and survival. Their unity created stability, a cosmic framework as secure as a tripod standing firm upon the ground. In hymns, the three are often invoked together, each representing a sphere of existence, heaven above, earth and atmosphere in the middle, and the watery depths below. By weaving their domains into harmony, Mesopotamians imagined the universe as held in equilibrium, one god watching the stars, one guiding the storms, and one stirring the rivers beneath the soil. For the ordinary person, these ideas filtered into life in quiet ways. A farmer hearing the first rumble of thunder might whisper a prayer to Enlil. A scribe copying long lists of words in Eridu schools might murmur an invocation to Enki for clarity. A king standing in a temple court, his crown lifted toward the sky, acknowledged Anu, the distant arbiter above. Symbols, seals, and laws all carried the same message. Order was not man-made, but God-given. To live in Mesopotamia was to exist within a system where every law, every contract, every seal pressed into clay carried echoes of a higher decree. The Anunnaki, through image and word, were ever-present guardians not only of cosmic balance but of the laws that structured human life. High above all, at the apex of divine hierarchy, stood Anu, the Sky Father. His name meant heaven itself, and his domain was the unreachable heights, far removed from mortal hands. In cuneiform hymns, Anu appears as the supreme arbiter, a god of vast authority who seldom intervened directly, but whose presence defined the order of the cosmos. Anu was remote, yet his remoteness was power. He was described as dwelling in the highest heaven, a place beyond even the other gods. From there he served as the ultimate judge, the one whose word could settle disputes among deities. But he did not govern through daily command. Instead, he delegated, entrusting authority to other gods who acted in his stead. His role was like that of the night sky itself, silent, unchanging, and vast, yet always enclosing the world. Myths emphasize this character. In the Enuma Elish, when the primordial goddess Tiamat rose against the younger gods, Anu confronted her, but found himself unable to prevail. Instead, he passed on his Anu power to Marduk, who would defeat her and establish a new cosmic order. Here, Anu's strength was not in combat, but in the transfer of legitimacy, the ability to invest others with the mantle of authority. On Earth, his presence was most strongly felt in Uruk, the city that housed his great temple. Rebuilt many times over centuries, the temple complex embodied his lofty domain. Its ziggurat rose upward in layered stages, symbolizing the ascent from the human world into the realm of heaven. Each step carried worshippers closer to Anu's sphere, culminating in the sacred chamber at the summit. At the top of this ziggurat took place the sacred marriage rite, where king and priestess embodied Dumuzi and Inanna, reenacting divine union to renew fertility and order. Though Anu himself was distant, his temple was the axis around which life in Uruk revolved. Priests ascending the stairways enacted a symbolic climb through the cosmos, bringing the city into harmony with the Sky Father's order. One can imagine the view from the summit, the Euphrates glinting in the distance, fields stretching outward like a green mosaic, stars slowly brightening in the twilight sky. For those who stood there, the city below must have seemed small, while the heavens above spread without end, a reminder of Anu's place, vast and silent, beyond reach. To call upon Anu was to invoke the highest authority, the principle of kingship itself. He was less a personal protector than a cosmic presence, the backdrop against which the drama of gods and humans unfolded. His distance was not neglect but permanence, a reassurance that above the storms of Enlil and the waters of Enki, there remained a sky that endured, and a god who embodied its eternal order. If Anu embodied the distant heavens, Enlil was the force that pressed upon daily life. His name meant Lord of Air, and his realm was the atmosphere itself, the breath between earth and sky, the storms that broke across the plains, the winds that carried both life and destruction. Cuneiform texts describe him as King of all lands and Lord of abundance. He was the god whose will shaped harvests and who commanded the tempests. His storms could flatten cities, but his rains could also swell rivers and bring fertility to fields. For Mesopotamians, Enlil's moods were not distant abstractions. They were felt in the very soil underfoot, in the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, in the sudden thunder that rolled across summer skies. The heart of his cult was Nippur, a city that stood as the spiritual capital of Mesopotamia. Kings from across Sumer, Akkad, and later Babylon sought legitimacy there. In Nippur's great temple, the Ekur, they humbled themselves before Enlil, seeking his blessing. Without it, no ruler's claim was secure. Inscriptions record how dynasties restored Enlil's temple for the Anunnaki who decree fate, acknowledging that royal power was nothing without the sanction of the storm god and the wider divine council. Religious archives from Nippur preserve detailed accounts of how priests interpreted natural signs as Enlil's messages. A violent storm, an eclipse, or an untimely flood, all could be read as expressions of his will. Such interpretations carried real political weight. Before embarking on military campaigns or issuing reforms, rulers sought signs of Enlil's approval. Even the Code of Hammurabi, centuries later, declared in its prologue that Anu and Enlil had chosen Hammurabi to bring justice to the land. Law and kingship alike drew their strength from his authority. Yet Enlil was not only a god of politics and power. Hymns describe him as Lord of Abundance, master of the flooding rivers, the fertility of soil, the increase of herds. The Farmer's Almanac, a practical guide preserved in cuneiform, begins with prayers to Enlil, acknowledging his role in guiding the rhythms of agriculture. For farmers bending over canals, sowing barley into furrows, Enlil was as present as the wind that cooled their backs or the rain that darkened their fields. Imagine a summer evening in Nippur, clouds gathering on the horizon, thunder rolling like a distant drum. To the people, this was not merely weather. It was Enlil speaking, his breath sweeping across the land, reminding them that their survival, their crops, their herds, their kings, depended on his favour. Where Anu's sky was still and eternal, Enlil's presence was restless, immediate, and unpredictable. He was the god whose storms could destroy or sustain, the power that bound politics and agriculture alike to the rhythms of heaven's breath. If Anu was distant and Enlil stern, Enki was the god who leaned closest to humanity. His realm was the Abzu, the great freshwater ocean believed to flow beneath the earth. From it came rivers, wells, and canals, the lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization. Without Enki's waters, the fields would wither, and the cities would fall silent. But Enki's gifts extended beyond water. He was the god of wisdom, invention, and craft, the patron of knowledge that made urban life possible. In myths, he is often depicted as a mediator, using cleverness and compassion to solve problems that rigid decrees could not. Where Enlil's commands were final, Enki found ways to soften them, bringing balance through insight. The Atrahasis epic preserves his most famous act of mercy. When the gods resolved to destroy humanity with a flood, bound by oaths of secrecy, Enki could not intervene directly. Instead, he whispered to the reed walls of Atrahasis' house, letting the sound seep through. "Build a vessel," the message implied. "Preserve life." Through this indirect act, Enki ensured that humankind would endure. His wisdom found a loophole where blunt authority had closed every door. On Earth, Enki's presence was most vivid in Eridu, one of Mesopotamia's oldest cities. Excavations reveal a temple complex that was not only a place of ritual but also a center of learning. There, priests taught scribes to press cuneiform signs into clay. Workshops trained craftsmen in metallurgy, textiles, and pottery. Archives held technical manuals on irrigation, medicine, and even early forms of chemistry. Enki's temple was a house of knowledge, where sacred duty and practical skill intertwined. Picture the daily life of Eridu. A young apprentice sits in a shaded courtyard, carefully tracing wedge-shaped signs onto a damp tablet while his teacher chants lists of words. Nearby, craftsmen hammer bronze, weave patterned cloth, or grind herbs into remedies. The air carries the scent of reeds cut from canals, mixed with smoke from small fires used in experiments. For the people, this was Enki's presence wisdom poured into human hands. Hymns describe him as Lord of the Flowing Waters, guiding the underground streams that fed the Tigris and Euphrates. Myths recount how he designed irrigation channels and taught humans to manage them, ensuring abundance in a land where rain was scarce. In these stories, theology and engineering blended seamlessly. To dig a canal was not just labor, it was an act of worship, aligning human effort with divine design. Unlike Anu's distance or Enlil's severity, Enki was imagined as a protector, even a teacher. His wisdom reached down into the smallest details of life, from the way water was channeled through fields to the way words were shaped into writing. In him, the people of Mesopotamia saw a god who not only ruled but cared, guiding them toward survival and knowledge. Enki's compassion, his cleverness, and his willingness to bend rules for the sake of life made him unique among the great gods. To call on Enki was to hope not for thunder or decree, but for guidance, a whisper in the reeds, a solution hidden in the flow of water, wisdom enough to carry humanity through the challenges of existence. The Anunnaki's authority was not only invoked in hymns and rituals, it was dramatized in the great epics, where gods gathered in solemn assembly to deliberate over crises that shaped the fate of the world. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, after Gilgamesh and Enkidu slew Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and later killed the bull of heaven, the gods convened to decide punishment. The scene is striking. Deities seated in judgment, weighing the arrogance of mortals against the sanctity of cosmic order. Different voices argued different outcomes. Some demanded harsh retribution, others urged restraint. In the end, the assembly settled on a compromise. Enkidu would die, while Gilgamesh would live on to face sorrow and wisdom. It was not a single god's decree, but a decision of balance, reached through debate. The Atrahasis epic presents another divine council, one that changed the course of human existence. The Agigi, the lesser gods, had grown weary of their endless toil. For years they dug canals, raised temples, and sustained the burden of divine labor. At last, in rebellion, they set down their tools and surrounded Enlil's dwelling in protest. Alarmed, the Anunnaki convened in the Ubshu Ukinna, the assembly hall of heaven. Enlil demanded punishment, but Enki offered a solution: create a new being to carry the work. From this council came humanity itself, shaped from clay and divine blood to serve in place of the weary gods. These councils were not just stories, they were reflections of how Mesopotamians understood justice and power. Decisions were not random nor left to chance. They were weighed, argued, and sealed in assembly. The structure mirrored human institutions: councils of elders, city assemblies, courts of law. Just as people gathered to debate disputes in courtyards, so too did the gods convene to decide the fate of mortals. Imagine the silence of those councils as the text described them. Gods seated in a circle, their voices rising one by one, the air heavy with deliberation, no decree rushed, no decision made without form. Even divine justice required process. For the people who heard these epics recited at night, perhaps in the courtyards of temples or by the firelight of homes, such scenes offered reassurance. If even the gods deliberated, then the universe itself was ordered by balance. Behind every storm, every famine, every sudden fortune, there was not chaos but a council. And though humans could not attend these assemblies, they could trust that their lives unfolded within decisions made long ago in chambers above. To fall asleep to these stories was to rest in the belief that the cosmos was not ruled by accident, but by voices gathered in solemn debate, a council of gods whose decrees shaped both heaven and earth. If the divine councils explained how the world was governed, the creation myths explained why humankind existed at all. In Mesopotamian tradition, the answer was clear. People were fashioned to serve the gods. The Atrahasis epic tells how the Igigi, the lesser gods, rebelled against their heavy labours. For decades they had dug canals, raised temple walls, and farmed the earth to feed the Anunnaki. At last they cast down their tools, their rebellion rising like smoke in the night. Alarmed, the great gods assembled in council. Enlil demanded order. Enki proposed a solution: create a new race, one that would bear the work the lesser gods had abandoned. The process of creation was solemn and strange. A god of intelligence, Ila, was chosen for sacrifice. His blood was mixed with clay, the very earth of Mesopotamia, to form a living substance. 14 lumps were pinched off, shaped by birth goddesses into 7 male and 7 female forms. For 10 months, mirroring human pregnancy, the first people took shape. The result was beings of both earth and divinity, intelligent enough to obey commands, yet fragile, bound by the limits of flesh. Other traditions offer different visions. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the goddess Aruru moulded Enkidu from clay as a wild man of the steppe. He roamed with animals, drank from streams, his body covered in hair. Only through human contact and instruction in food, drink, and love was he transformed into a civilized companion. This story suggested that humanity was not only created once, but continually reshaped through culture, knowledge, and ritual. Babylon's great creation epic, the Enuma Elish, gave yet another version. After Marduk's victory over Tiamat, he proposed forming humankind from the blood of Kingu, the defeated rebel god who had led her armies. In this version, humanity carried within it the essence of rebellion, as well as service. Born of both clay and the blood of a traitor, people were imagined as creatures capable of loyalty and defiance, alike reflections of the gods' own conflicts. These variations reveal not contradiction but richness. Some emphasized labor, humans as the gods' workers, designed to sustain temples and sacrifices. Others emphasized transformation, wild beings shaped into culture and law. Still others emphasized duality, human hearts divided between obedience and rebellion. Festivals often reenacted these origins. During New Year rites, priests molded clay figurines while reciting incantations of creation. The ritual reminded participants of their beginnings. Fragile statues animated by divine spark, destined for service. For those who watched, it was a reminder that life itself was sacred, given purpose by gods who had mixed their own essence into clay. To fall asleep to these stories was to dream of beginnings, of goddesses kneeling like midwives over clay, of blood and earth pressed together, of humanity rising fragile yet purposeful. In Mesopotamia, people lived with the quiet knowledge that their lives were not accidents, but deliberate creations shaped to bear the work of the gods, yet carrying within them the mystery of divine essence. If creation explained why humanity existed, the flood stories explained why it almost did not. In Mesopotamian thought, the gods were creators, but they were also judges. And when humankind grew too numerous, too restless, the balance threatened to unravel. The Atrahasis epic describes how, within a few centuries of human creation, the land was filled with noise. People built, sang, feasted, and multiplied. To the gods above, especially Enlil, this constant clamour was unbearable. Humanity had been made to serve, not to crowd the earth with its independence. The divine council was summoned, and the verdict was clear. Humanity must be diminished. At first, the punishments came in waves. Plagues struck, then famine, then drought. But again and again, Enki, the god of wisdom and waters, found ways to help. He taught rituals of healing, guided people to hidden food supplies, whispered methods of survival. Humanity endured, and its voices continued to rise. At last, Enlil called for a final solution, a flood that would erase humankind from the earth. The plan was sealed with oaths. None of the gods was permitted to warn mortals, but Enki, bound by compassion as much as by law, found a way to bend the rules. He did not speak directly to Atrahasis, the wise man chosen for survival. Instead, he whispered to the reed walls of his house, letting his words flow like water into the air. Through this cleverness, the message was carried: build an ark, a vessel to preserve life. The instructions were precise. The ark was to be a cube, 120 cubits in length, width, and height. Its planks were sealed with bitumen, its frame bound with palm fibre. Inside, Atrahasis stored food, drink, and animals, pairs of wild and domestic creatures, symbols of the world's renewal. The ark itself became a miniature cosmos, carrying within it the seeds of a future yet to be written. When the flood came, it came with fury. The storm god Adad unleashed torrents from the sky. While the fountains of the deep broke open below, the world was swallowed in darkness. For 7 days and nights the waters raged, a cosmic week of unmaking. Even the gods trembled, texts say, cowering like dogs at the edges of heaven. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, wept at the destruction, mourning the loss of her human worshippers. At last the waters began to fall. Atrahasis released birds, a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. Only when the raven failed to return did he know the earth was dry. His ark came to rest upon Mount Nisir, its slopes providing stone, wood, and fresh streams for renewal. The first act upon leaving the vessel was sacrifice. Atrahasis built an altar and offered animals, the smoke rising into the sky. The gods, deprived of offerings during the flood, gathered eagerly, like flies around the savour. Enlil raged when he learned humanity had survived, but Enki defended his act. Without people who would maintain temples, who would bring offerings, who would keep the divine order alive on earth, the council relented, but with conditions. Never again would humans live unchecked. Mortality, sickness, and limits were decreed to keep the balance in place. The flood story was not only about destruction, it was about renewal, about the fragile covenant between gods and mortals. For Mesopotamians, it explained why life was short, why rituals mattered, why existence was always balanced on the edge of favour and wrath. To fall asleep to the flood story was to drift into a world of storms and silence, of ships riding dark waters, of a dove returning with an olive branch. It was to know that even in destruction, wisdom and compassion could preserve a remnant enough to begin again. The flood ended not with silence alone, but with a new arrangement between gods and mortals. The Atrahasis story tells us that once the waters receded, the divine assembly gathered again, troubled by the consequences of their decision. Enlil raged at humanity's survival, while other gods mourned the loss of offerings, recognizing how dependent they had become on the rituals of mortals. Into this debate stepped Enki, who had defended life from the beginning. His argument was simple but profound. The complete destruction of humanity harmed not only mortals but the gods themselves. Without worshippers, temples fell silent. Without sacrifices, divine households went unfed. Enki urged balance rather than annihilation. The assembly agreed to a compromise. Humanity would endure, but under new limits. Mortality was set firmly in place. No longer could humans live for thousands of years like the kings of old. Disease and infertility would touch families, thinning the numbers. Institutions such as celibate priesthoods would keep populations within bounds. Through these natural checks, the world would remain stable without the need for catastrophic floods. This covenant reshaped the fabric of Mesopotamian belief. Humanity was fragile by design, subject to suffering, yet preserved as essential partners in the cosmic order. Survival was no longer taken for granted. It depended on constant balance between divine decree and human devotion. In practice, this covenant manifested in the system of patron deities. Each great god chose a city as their earthly dwelling. Enlil resided at Nippur, Anu at Uruk, Enki at Eridu, and Inanna at Uruk as well, her presence weaving love and war into civic life. From then onward, Mesopotamian cities were not just political units but sacred domains. To live in a city was to live under the watch of its patron, a god whose temple anchored urban life. The temples themselves were more than shrines. They became permanent residences of the gods' earthly houses, where deities were clothed, fed, and honored each day. Priests washed and dressed the cult statues, laid food upon tables, and burned incense so that the divine presence would remain. Ritual was not symbolic, it was maintenance of the covenant. By caring for their gods, humans secured the gods' protection. Imagine standing in Nippur at dawn. The great ziggurat looms, its tiers glowing gold in the rising Sunday. Priests climb the steps carrying offerings. From the courtyard below rises the low hum of hymns, voices weaving into the morning wind. The people know their part, to labour, to sacrifice, to sustain. The gods, in turn, decree fate, guide the rivers, and uphold the order of the cosmos. Thus, after the flood, life was reshaped into a partnership, unequal, yet enduring. Humans were limited, mortal, bound to serve. The gods were powerful but dependent, needing the devotion of those they had nearly destroyed. The covenant ensured that the world would continue, fragile yet balanced, renewed each day in the meeting of prayer, offering, and divine decree. In the centuries after the flood, the covenant between gods and mortals took visible form in the cities of Mesopotamia. Each city was watched over by a patron deity, a divine protector who shaped its destiny. To live within city walls was not only to belong to a community of people, but to enter the household of a god. At Nippur, Enlil ruled from the towering Ekur temple, his authority stretching across all of Sumer. At Eridu, Enki's presence infused the schools, workshops and canals with wisdom and flowing water. At Uruk, Inanna, goddess of both love and war, brought passion and power to civic life. And at the moon god Nanna presided over the cycles of time, his temple serving as a calendar for trade, harvest and worship. These temples were not symbolic alone. They were believed to be the very dwellings of the gods, where statues served as the physical seat of divine presence. Priests bathed, dressed, and fed these statues daily. To bring a meal of bread and beer was not an offering in name only. It was nourishment for a god who, in return, sustained the city's fortune. One of the most vivid rituals connecting gods and mortals was the sacred marriage. In Uruk, during the New Year festival, the king assumed the role of Dumuzi, Inanna's consort. A high priestess embodied Inanna herself. Together, they enacted a symbolic union, ensuring fertility for the land, prosperity for the city, and the renewal of royal legitimacy. The ceremony required months of preparation. Costumes of shimmering textiles were woven, hymns composed, incense gathered. At night, under the stars, the rite was performed in the temple's highest chamber. For those who watched from the courtyards below, the ritual was more than theatre. It was cosmic renewal, a union of heaven and earth replayed each year to guarantee abundance. The moon god Nanna, patron of also shaped the rhythms of daily life. His temple was not only a place of devotion but also an astronomical observatory. Priests tracked the waxing and waning of the moon, using its phases to regulate calendars. Merchants planned journeys by it, farmers set planting and harvest, and festivals aligned with lunar cycles. By watching the moon, they believed they were reading Nanna's guiding hand. Imagine standing in the city of at night, the ziggurat's tiers gleaming white in the moonlight. On its summit, priests raise polished bronze instruments to the sky, marking the movement of the heavens. Below, citizens whisper prayers, knowing that the moon's path was the god's way of keeping time itself in harmony. Through these patron deities, the covenant after the flood was lived out. Each city became a reflection of its god, wise like Enki's Eridu, powerful like Enlil's Nipper, radiant like Inanna's Uruk, ordered like Nanna's Ur. The gods were no longer distant overseers. They had taken residence among the people, binding their divine fate to the fate of cities that pulsed with human devotion. If temples were the houses of the gods, the priesthood was their household staff. Day and night, priests, priestesses, scribes, and musicians tended to divine needs, ensuring that the covenant between mortals and the Anunnaki remained unbroken. The hierarchy was complex. At the top stood the high priest or high priestess, figures who acted as intermediaries between god and city. Beneath them served administrators who managed temple estates, scribes who recorded every transaction in clay, and ritual specialists who performed prayers, music, and purification. Each role was necessary, each act sacred. To neglect even a single duty risked offending the divine presence dwelling in the shrine. Women played important roles in this order. Naditu priestesses lived in temple precincts, often from wealthy or royal families. They managed land, lent silver, and controlled estates, wielding real economic power under divine protection. Entu priestesses, chosen for the highest roles, embodied goddesses in ritual. In these women, the boundary between human and divine blurred, and through their service the gods were honoured as if they walked among mortals. The temple was also a place of knowledge. Schools for scribes, known as Adubba, the tablet houses, trained generations of students. Here, young apprentices learned to press wedge-shaped cuneiform signs into damp clay. They memorized long lists of words, practiced proverbs, copied hymns, and eventually mastered mathematics, astronomy, and law. To write was itself a sacred act, for cuneiform signs were believed to preserve the decrees of the gods. Picture an Adubba at dawn, rows of boys sitting cross-legged, each with a lump of clay on their knees, stylus in hand. Their teacher recites lines, and the students echo them, marking strokes with steady rhythm. Outside, the temple courtyards fill with the sound of flutes and drums as musicians prepare for ritual. Within these walls, learning was not separate from worship. It was worship, an act of devotion to Enki, patron of wisdom. The priesthood also preserved astronomy and divination, arts essential for reading the will of the gods. Priests charted the paths of the stars, the phases of the moon, the flights of birds. Every eclipse, every storm, every unusual birth was recorded as an omen, a sign that the Anunnaki had spoken. By interpreting these signs, priests guided kings and farmers alike. Music and ritual completed the cycle. Hymns were sung with lyres and flutes, echoing through vast courtyards. Incantations were whispered over the sick, accompanied by the smoke of burning herbs. Every gesture, every sound, was part of a language addressed to the divine. In this way, the priesthood stood at the centre of city life. They maintained the gods' houses, preserved the written word, interpreted the heavens, and guided the people. Knowledge, ritual, and devotion flowed together. To learn was to serve. To serve was to honour, and to honour was to keep the fragile covenant between mortals and the Anunnaki intact. As centuries passed, the balance of divine authority shifted. Just as the power of cities rose and fell, the Anunnaki remained at the heart of belief, but new empires reshaped which gods stood foremost among them. In the south, Babylon emerged, and with it rose Marduk. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's great creation epic, tells how Marduk defeated Tiamat, the dragon of primordial chaos. In triumph, he split her body, forming heaven and earth from her remains. Then he arranged the constellations, set the calendar, and established order. Finally, he was elevated above the older gods, receiving their powers and titles. Marduk's rise mirrored Babylon's own. As the city became a political centre, its patron god absorbed the functions once held by Enlil or even Anu. Kings proclaimed themselves chosen by Marduk, guardians of the order he had established. Each new year, during the Akitu festival, his statue was paraded through the city streets, reaffirming his role as ruler of both cosmos and empire. To the north, another transformation unfolded. The Assyrians, heirs of Akkadian traditions, placed their devotion in Ashur. His very name became the name of their capital. In inscriptions, Ashur was depicted as commander of divine armies, a god of conquest and expansion. Where Marduk represented order and creation, Ashur embodied the might of empire. Kings described their campaigns as carried out on Ashur's command, their victories as proof of his favour. This theological shift was mirrored in architecture. In Babylon, the Ishtar Gate rose its glazed blue bricks inlaid with lions, dragons and bulls, symbols of divine guardianship. The massive ziggurat known as Anunnaki, the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth, towered above the city, perhaps inspiring later tales of the Tower of Babel. In Assyria, grand palaces spread across Nineveh and Nimrud, their walls carved with reliefs of winged genies, divine symbols meant to guard the empire. Imagine walking through Babylon during the Akitu festival. Trumpets sound, drums echo, and priests carry Marduk's statue from his temple, surrounded by chants and incense. Crowds press forward, offering prayers as the god passes. In that moment, the city itself becomes a theatre of cosmic renewal, its stones and streets bearing witness to the belief that divine power and political order were one. Yet for all these changes, the older gods were never forgotten. Anu, Enlil and Enki still lingered in hymns, rituals, and the memory of cities long past. The Anunnaki remained the collective presence behind fate itself. But their faces changed with the empires, shifting like constellations in the sky, new stars rising, old ones fading, yet all part of the same eternal heavens. Thus, through Babylon and Assyria, the Anunnaki story continued to evolve. Kings built higher walls and greater temples, priests recited new hymns, but beneath it all remained the same conviction, that order flowed downward from the gods, and that human empires were but reflections of divine councils above. The story of the Anunnaki did not end with Babylon or Assyria. As centuries passed, new empires rose, and their gods were reinterpreted through foreign eyes. Under the Hellenistic rulers, when Greek culture spread across Mesopotamia, the old deities were reshaped in new forms. The Babylonian priest Berosus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, translated Mesopotamian myths for Greek readers. He told of Oannes, a being who emerged from the sea to teach humanity wisdom, and of great floods and ancient kings. To the Greeks, the Anunnaki became strange yet familiar, their roles blended with Olympian gods, their stories woven into broader Mediterranean traditions. Through such accounts, Mesopotamian religion did not vanish. It adapted, carried into new languages and new imaginations. The influence was felt in astronomy and astrology as well. Babylonian priests had long charted the skies, recording eclipses, planetary movements, and omens. Their knowledge spread westward, shaping Greek and later Roman sciences. Even today, the zodiac we inherit carries traces of these ancient systems. What Mesopotamian priests once read as the writing of the Anunnaki in the heavens became, in time, the star charts of philosophers and scholars. For many centuries, however, the names of the Anunnaki lay buried. Their temples crumbled, their cities were covered by sand and time. It was not until the 19th century that their voices returned, when archaeologists unearthed tablets from Nineveh and Ur. The flood stories inscribed there stunned readers, echoing tales known from the Hebrew Bible. Scholars realized that behind familiar scriptures lay even older traditions, carved into clay by hands, long forgotten. In the modern age, the Anunnaki have been reborn in unexpected ways. Writers such as Zecharia Sitchin reimagined them as ancient astronauts, proposing that myths were misunderstood accounts of extraterrestrial visitors. Though scholars reject these interpretations, they found a wide audience, blending science fiction with deep history. Today, the Anunnaki appear in novels, films, video games, and conspiracy theories, their ancient names echoing in the digital age. Yet beyond these reinventions, the deeper legacy remains. The Anunnaki represent one of humanity's first attempts to explain the structure of existence, to imagine a universe ruled not by chaos but by councils, rituals, and laws. They were gods who judged, who decreed, who shaped humanity from clay and blood, who destroyed and preserved through the flood, who took residence in temples, and who granted kings the right to rule. To fall asleep to their story is to drift across 5,000 years of memory, From the mud-brick temples of Eridu to the starry charts of Babylonian scribes, from the sacred marriage rites of Uruk to the silent tablets buried in desert soil, the Anunnaki have lived many lives as gods, as symbols, as myths retold and reshaped. And still they endure, whispered through the ages, reminding us that long before modern science or modern faith, people stood under the same stars and wondered who was watching.